the Union Army, that although Stonewall Jackson was killed in that battle. So they're back on that same battlefield. Torrential rains had washed open many of the shallow graves from that battle, and there were many skeletons exposed. So it really was, for the soldiers, it must have been pretty ghoulish, pretty creepy to go down there and you're seeing all these skeletons and you're thinking, gee, that might be me in a day or two. Fighting breaks out on May 5th between parts of the two armies on the Confederate right. And by this time, the armies have turned a little bit. We talked about how Grant's trying to get around Lee's right. So the Confederate right is actually the north now. They're laid out kind of, well, how should I say this? They're kind of like northeast to southwest. And the wilderness is very, very thick. At the time, it was there's a lot of scrub brush, undergrowth, and I've been there, and it really is a wilderness. It still is today. Control of the armies is very difficult. Smoke filled the battlefield, which was already filled with trees of all sizes, and there were several incidents of friendly fire. Even this late in the war, people are accidentally shooting their own soldiers, their own, comrades, if you will. Fighting breaks out on the Confederate left, which is the south, and each side gives some ground. Each side lost some people by the end of the day, and fighting had stopped by the evening. On the morning of the 6th, the next day, Winfield Scott Hancock, his corps, smashed the part of the Confederate line that he faced, and Lee is obviously very stressed about this, and he wants to see what's happening. He rides out to the front to personally rally the troops. This is something he didn't usually do. And a group of Texas soldiers grabbed Lee's reins and ordered him to the rear. It's really kind of funny. He's the commander, and yet he's being ordered by privates and other lower people. They literally force him to stop, and they say, we will not go any further until you go back to the rear. They did not want him to be killed like so many other generals were killed. Now, just as the Confederate line is about to collapse, and how many times have we seen this, Scott? It's just, they're so close, and then, dun, 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 here comes
Rohan
the cavalry.
rides in.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. This is not cavalry, it's actually infantry. But again, Longstreet arrives. They had been out looking for food, but Longstreet's corps marches in, and once again, Longstreet saves the day. They stabilize the line, and they even push the Federals back. So fighting stops again in the evening. Now, because of all the artillery shells, a lot of fires had been set. And it was just awful because there were wounded soldiers that were caught in the area of the fires and they were unable to get away, and they just burned to death. Can you imagine the horror of that? Let's say you're wounded in the leg and you can't walk, you can't move, you can't even hardly crawl, and then here comes this fire. It's awful to think of. So in this battle, the Federals suffered about 17,500 casualties. Lee lost about 12,000, which is almost the exact same number as he had lost a year before at Chancellorsville. And this is about a sixth of each army. It was the third bloodiest battle of the war in terms of total casualties. So really bloody battle. And again, look at those numbers. The Union loses almost 18,000. The Confederates lose 12,000. So the Union actually loses more people, but the Confederacy can ill afford to lose 12,000. James Longstreet, ironically, was actually shot by some of his own troops. It's almost like deja vu. It's like a replay of Stonewall Jackson being shot by his own troops a year earlier. But the difference is that Longstreet does not die. Longstreet is not killed, but he is out for several months. So Lee loses his best corps commander, at least for a while. Now the battle, who won the battle? The battle was a slight tactical victory for Lee, but Grant refused to retreat. That's the difference between Grant and everybody who had come before him, not counting Meade, of course. But if you think about McClellan, McDowell, General Pope, General Burnside, General Hooker, what these generals had all done was they went down, they attacked Lee, they lost, and then they retreated and they left. Grant doesn't retreat. Instead, he just keeps right on going. He tries to move around Lee's right one more time towards a place called Spotsylvania Courthouse. And the Union soldiers cheered when they realized they were moving toward Richmond and not retreating. They literally reached this fork in the road, or a turning point, we would say an intersection, where if they had turned left, they would have been going back toward Washington, but they didn't. They turned right, and a great cheer breaks out. Can you imagine? They were just so excited to have a commander that's going to continue to fight, that's not going to give up after one loss. All right, so Lee moves as well to keep his army in between Grant and Richmond. Parts of his army reached Spotsylvania Courthouse first. Some were literally running to beat the Federals there, and they started entrenching.
And this is something that the Confederacy doesn't really know what's going on at first, because from first Grant's perspective, what he wants to do is place the Federals between Lee and Richmond and force Lee to leave the wilderness so that Grant can fight him on his own ground, the ground of his own choosing. Before it's clear that they're moving to Spotsylvania, Lee's confused about what Grant's next move is. Maybe they want to keep hammering them in the wilderness. Maybe they want to sidestep to Fredericksburg, press south along Richmond. Maybe they're preparing to march to Spotsylvania Courthouse. So it's not very clear at the beginning, but let's see what happens.
That's why they had to run. They realized, he's going to Spotsylvania. We can't let him get there. So they had to run. And and Lee wasn't used to facing somebody who keeps on coming. He doesn't quit and go home. Lee knew that Grant was a good general and that he was aggressive, but wasn't quite prepared for this. He didn't have much experience with fighting competent opponents. All right, shall we go on to Spotsylvania?
Let's.
All right, and this is May 8th, so it's just a few days after the wilderness started, and it's almost continuous fighting. On May 8th, parts of the two armies collided without much effect. And that evening, the two armies begin to entrench. And we've seen this before. We were talking about this in the West, around Atlanta, in a previous episode. This has become standard procedure. Both sides, before they do any kind of fighting, they build trenches. We're moving in the direction of World War I style warfare. Not there yet. These are not the elaborate networks of trenches that you see in World War I, but it's a beginning. The two sides, they realize that if the other side attacks, they need to be ready and they need to be dug in with a good defensive position. So the next morning, one of the corps commanders in the Union Army, this is just kind of an interesting story, ironic, one of the many ironies of the Civil War. General John Sedgwick, this was a very popular general. His troops loved him. They called him Uncle John. He was inspecting his corps' line. Some of his officers warned him to be careful. And he said, "Oh, boys, they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." And immediately after this, he was shot through the head by a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet, and he died instantly.
That's a factoid that is just spread throughout the middle schools and high schools of this great land. You could forget every detail from the Civil War, but that there has lived on, that fact.
Yeah, it's I don't want to say it's a great story. It's terrible. It's sad, but just kind of a classic example of famous last words and hubris. They can actually hit anything. So Uncle John is out, and he was the highest ranking Union general to be killed during the war. Okay. Now, the Union Army, the Union commander, Grant and Meade, they realized that Lee's line has a weakness. There's a big salient called the mule shoe, and a salient is basically a bulge. It's like a little. This is kind of gross, but the first thing that popped into my head was a pimple, just sticking out.
Let's pop that pimple and just spray the other line with what comes out.
Yes, I have raised 4 teenagers. Anyway, so this salient or this bulge, it was called the mule shoe. It was sticking out toward the Federals. So on the 10th, the Union soldiers broke a hole in the salient. They attacked it, and they're starting to punch through. The next day, Union troops moved up, and the day after that, the 12th, the 20,000 troops under Hancock, General Winfield Scott Hancock, they overrun the mule shoe. So it's looking good for the Union for a while, but the Confederates regained control, and the worst close combat of the entire war took place. There was a lot of hand-to-hand fighting. We talked in a previous episode about how when you watch movies of the Civil War, it doesn't matter what the movie is, you're always going to see bayonets being stuck in people and people hitting them with the rifle butt and people even fist fighting. That didn't happen a whole lot in the Civil War, but here it did because they were so close together. One part of the salient became known as the Bloody Angle because so many people were killed there. And the firing at this battle was so intense that several trees, including a 22-inch oak, meaning 22 inches across, that's the diameter, these trees were just cut down merely by musket and artillery fire. In other words, so many bullets were fired, they literally cut down some trees. The fighting continued for the next several days, and on the 21st, Grant disengaged. He realized this is not really working the way I want it to, so we're going to pull out. The Federals lost another 18,000 casualties, so that's 36,000 so far, and the Confederates lost 13,000. So another incredibly bloody battle, and again, it's another draw. Neither side really accomplishes its objectives. Certainly the Union doesn't accomplish their objectives. Lee, I guess you could say Lee in a way does because he fights off another Union attack, but he loses so many people. It's really kind of a Pyrrhic victory. Now, in the meantime, a fellow named Philip Sheridan, can't remember if we've talked about Sheridan before. I think I have. He's one of these younger Union officers coming up through the ranks. I think he started out as a captain at the beginning of the war, maybe even lower rank, but now he's a general. He's in charge of cavalry. He leads a cavalry raid all the way down to Richmond. There he encounters a rebel detachment under Jeb Stuart. Good old Jeb, the chief of Confederate cavalry. Sheridan is quickly rising up to become the head of Union cavalry. So Sheridan and Stuart slug it out. Their forces fight at the Battle of the Yellow Tavern on May 11th. And in this battle, Jeb Stuart is mortally wounded, and he dies the next day. So that is the end of Stuart. So another great Confederate commander is gone. Grant, after this, he writes Lincoln home. He writes home to Lincoln, or it's not really home, he writes to Washington, but he writes a letter to President Lincoln saying that I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer.
And there's a lot of other bad news that comes from the subsidiary armies of Grant at the same time. So for Grant himself, Spotsylvania looks impregnable. But then on other fronts, there's problems. You mentioned one. Also, rebels under Breckinridge defeat Sigel at New Market. The Union offensive in the Shenandoah Valley doesn't work. I think Beauregard defeats Butler at Drury's Bluff. So at the same time, all these problems are happening. So Grant figures, all right, it's up to me. It's up to my army to defeat Lee. So next step.
Yeah, that really helped build Union morale, at least somewhat. I'm going to fight it out if it takes all summer. That was the kind of fighting spirit that Lincoln had been so desperately looking for years. Now he's finally got it.
So, all right, next step.
Yeah.
North End.
All right, we're going to do it again. By late May, Grant's and Lee's armies were exhausted. They'd just been almost in continual combat for nearly a month. This is a new thing. We haven't really seen this before. We haven't seen this idea of the Union attacks. You have a big battle, then the Union attacks again, and they just keep hitting and hitting and hitting. That was one of Grant's philosophies of warfare, was to hit hard and to hit often. So that's exactly what he's doing. Since May 5th, there had been 24,000 Confederate and 36,000 Union casualties. That's just staggering. So that's 60,000 men total in just a month who had fallen, either killed, wounded, or captured, or missing. Both sides are getting replacement soldiers, but the new soldiers were not of the same quality as the ones they replaced. Especially the Union ones they're just kind of like, they're older, they're younger. Some of them are like prisoners and things like that. They're just not the same caliber. May 23rd, Grant tries again to move his army around Lee's right flank and to place his army between Lee and Richmond. So he keeps trying this. This time, Lee anticipated the action, and he placed his army behind the North Anna River. Lee's army was deployed in an inverted V. Grant deployed his army in a very awkward formation. So Lee had the interior lines. Grant had terrible lines. But interestingly enough, for the first time in the war, Lee becomes seriously ill, and he has to be confined to his bed. Lee didn't have any subordinates whom he fully trusted, so he wasn't able to plan and order an attack on Grant. Who's he going to put in charge?